One acid test to effective political leadership is preparing public opinion. And I might even be more specific by saying preparing the public for bad news or the possibility of bad news. In late 1967, the United States had been involved in major military operations in South Vietnam for more than 2 years. We had nearly 500,000 armed personnel stationed in and around South Vietnam. Now, for the first 2 or 3 years of our involvement, and this may surprise some of you, the press and much of the public was giving President Lyndon Johnson the benefit of the doubt. They had some misgivings about old Lyndon, old Uncle Cornpone, as Bill Buckley called him, but he was the president, and they essentially trusted him. And this was buttressed by claims the administration kept making that the war was going well. But in the second half of 1967, war fatigue was setting in. There were signs in the polls, and polling was being done at this time, that support for the war was beginning to lag. Journalists were beginning, and I stress just beginning, to be skeptical of our involvement. They were not being critical of our involvement. They were being skeptical. There's a difference there. If the polls told us anything in 1967, more Americans wanted us to escalate our involvement, that is, put more troops into South Vietnam than to de-escalate. The administration was increasingly mindful of this. Now, Lyndon Johnson was a very charismatic man. He used to walk around the White House carrying poll results in his coat pocket. Could you imagine this, running into old Lyndon? Mr. President, how are you? See how popular I am in Rhode Island? Well, Lyndon Johnson was looking at the polls, and his people were. They made a critical decision, fateful decision. They would launch a public relations offensive late in 1967 to reassure the American people that the war was going well, that progress was being made. General Westmoreland, our commander in South Vietnam, came to Washington and said as much to the National Press Club. Members of the administration made themselves available on the network news shows. One senior advisor assured viewers of ABC's Scope program that the war was being won and that the possibility of a major offensive was all but impossible. Secretary of State Dean Rusk at the AFL-CIO annual convention compared critics of the war to Adolf Hitler's stormtroopers. This offensive was working. Support for the war rose slightly in the polls, and even some newspapers that had earlier expressed misgivings changed their mind. We now know that President Johnson and his people made a terrible mistake. They had not prepared the American people for what came. In late January 1968, what is now commonly called the Tet Offensive, coinciding with the Tet holiday in Vietnam, North Vietnamese and National Liberation Front forces launched a major assault across South Vietnam, including, and this was more perilous, the cities where fighting had been absent for 3 years. The public, and more importantly, the press, were totally unprepared for this outcome. Johnson, one historian has written, had failed to prepare the media and the nation for the possibility of such an attack. The head of NBC's News Bureau, Ron Steinman, had given his employees the holiday off, not anticipating anything like this. When the offensive finally came, the press lost what little remaining support or belief it had in Lyndon Johnson. With this attack, with this assault, Johnson's credibility, already in doubt, rose. His presidency, for all practical purposes, was destroyed. My lesson to you, good people, should you ever be president, is to allow for the possibility of bad news. The people can handle it. The people can handle it.